friends, my name is Olivia. I make videos about books on the internet, and today I want to talk about book piracy. There was a huge conversation the other day about book piracy on Twitter that I found really interesting, and I also had a few issues with. There was a lot about the way the conversation was framed that really bothered me that I want to talk about in this video, but I also want to talk about piracy in general. And before I can get into those things that bothered me, I really want to spend some time establishing what piracy is, establishing how it affects the publishing industry, and establishing how difficult it is for authors to get by being full-time artists, being full-time authors. I'm going to be using a lot of different information sources in this video. I have learned a lot of things over the last few weeks and over my time as a person interested in the publishing industry. So I will link all of my sources down below. They're fantastic sources, and I really appreciate everyone who took the time to put them out on the internet. So let's just begin to jump in and dig into this issue. So I am not 100% sure when or where this conversation started, but I'm pretty sure, at least for me, it started with Adam Silvera. Adam Silvera, who's a very popular YA author, you guys probably know or have heard of some of his books. He was tweeting basically about book piracy and why he was against it and why it made him angry, and for whatever reason this generated a much larger conversation from his followers and from other authors. Before we get really into it, I kind of just want to lay out a basic definition of book piracy for us to have as we move forward, and also just talk about how book piracy affects the industry and how it affects authors. Book piracy, as some of you are probably aware of, is reading books, downloading books for free online. The advent of ebooks has made this a lot easier and a lot more of a damage on the industry. I think for a lot of people, music piracy and movie piracy are pretty common. I'm sure all of us at some point in our life have downloaded music illegally or have watched a movie on a streaming site that we didn't pay for or didn't watch on like Netflix or Hulu. And those kinds of piracies I think are so normalized, and we see them as having such a little effect on these industries that are really massive that we extend that viewpoint of piracy to other industries like the book industry. It truly is different for the book industry, and the first thing I want to talk about is how authors are paid, particularly because a lot of people were firing back at Adam Silvera, basically saying, you're rich, like you're wealthy, you don't get to have a stake in this conversation about what people do in order to afford books. And I think it's really important to clear up that misconception about authors' wealth. I want to give a big shout out to Nicole Brinkley at NE Brinkley on Twitter, who wrote this really long and informative thread about how authors are paid. I'm not going to read the entire thing for you, but I do want to sum up some key points that I think will get us all on the same page and help us realize, damn, like authors really aren't paid that much. I don't think this is a surprise to a lot of people, but reading this thread, it was really interesting to see exactly how authors are paid. So when you get a book deal, when you land a book deal with a publishing house, you are paid in advance. Most advances range from $10,000 to $30,000. A really good YA deal might get you $40,000, which is kind of on the higher end, and that's the number that Nicole used for this thread. Which might seem like a lot of money, but it is not, because first of all, it's divided into two payments. You get half upon signing the contract and half upon delivering the manuscript. Some publishing houses might do it differently. Some might split it into 3 payments, but this is really common, 2 payments, right? If you have $40,000 advance, which seems pretty big, now you're getting $20,000 on that date. And then that is the money that has to sustain you as you edit and rewrite and work on your manuscript to have it eventually ready to be published. $20,000 is not a huge amount of money to live on depending on where you live. And Nicole basically did the math and calculating what you need to pay your literary agent and what you need to pay in tax on that money. It'll be about $12,000, from $20,000 to $12,000. And of course, knowing this, most authors do all this editing and do all this work around a full-time job because you can't live on $12,000 a year, right? And then eventually the manuscript is delivered, you get your other half of the check, which we know is about $12,000. So you've got $24,000 from all this work that you've done, and now you have to hope that your book sells. In advance is the amount of money the publishers think they can make off of your book. So if you get a $40,000 advance, they think that that's the amount of money that your book will pull in. Anything you do beyond that becomes royalties, right? So there's no guarantee that you'll sell beyond your advance date. And of course with royalties, if your book goes for $15 in a bookstore, you're not getting all that money, right? There are so many other people who are being paid for the release of your book. Basically, I think we can all kind of take this and recognize that shit, authors aren't paid a lot of money. Most authors aren't full-time working authors. It's extremely difficult to be a full-time working author. So that's the number one thing I want to clear up. We shouldn't be getting down on authors and claiming that they're too rich to complain about these issues, because very clearly they're not. But that brings us into the second thing I think is really important to talk about, which is the question of how much does piracy actually affect authors and actually affect the publishing industry. Piracy is so easy to do, and we so rarely actually see the effects of it talked about and fleshed out that it's very easy for us to not recognize what it's actually doing to authors. So I want to bring in a few interesting stories and sources that I have learned over my life and learned this week that I thought were incredibly interesting. So it's been estimated that unauthorized copies of digital books, right, pirated ebooks, have already cost American publishers $2.8 billion in lost sales. They also estimate that on average, nearly 10,000 copies of every book published are downloaded for free. This is an average, right? So we can assume it's pretty obvious that there are smaller books, smaller releases that aren't going to be illegally downloaded 10,000 times. We can also assume that there are larger releases then that will be downloaded more than 10,000 times. And we can also imagine that 10,000 illegal downloads, you're lucky if you sell 10,000 copies of your book, right? And I saw a tweet from Alexandra Bracken, who did the Darkest Minds trilogy, I believe, who tweeted about this. I once found a download link of Brightly Woven, my debut, that had more downloads on it than recorded sales in Bookscan. One link, right? If we can think about this number, $2.8 billion lost in sales, 10,000 illegal copies of a book on average are downloaded, right? We can begin to understand how much this will kill and hurt authors who are hoping to even sell that base amount. I also want to jump in with a really interesting story from Maggie Stiefvater, who was talking about releasing The Raven Cycle, and she mentioned how when it comes to series, it's diminishing returns, you called it, where every single book, the next book sells a little bit less than the first book did, which makes sense. So people who read the first book in the series decide they're not going to continue, stop buying them, same thing with the second and the third book. But she was surprised when her third book came out, Blue Lily Lily Blue, and she saw a humongous drop in sales when it came to ebooks. And because of this, she suspected this was due to piracy. But because of this, the publishers told her that they were cutting the print run of The Raven King to less than half of the print run for Blue Lily Lily Blue. Very clear, direct cause and effect, right? Your book sold less because of piracy. We're not going to publish as many copies, it's just not profitable for us. They didn't say it was because of piracy though, and so she wanted to kind of do a little experiment. I thought this was pretty cheeky. So what she did was, in order to prove how piracy was affecting it, she created these PDFs of The Raven King. I'm pretty sure it was like the first 10 pages were the actual book, and then after that, it just repeated this message about do not pirate, like my name is Maggie Stiefvater, like this is how piracy affects the publishing industry. And she had her brother help her upload it onto dozens of pirate sites, dozens and dozens of copies of the PDF of The Raven King. So if you were looking for a PDF of The Raven King, you were most likely going to find that illegal pirated copy. There was a lot to talk about this on forums. Lots of fans were like, can anyone find a legit PDF? Every PDF I found is not the actual book. And then they ended up selling out of the first printing in 2 days. 2 days. Because people who were trying to pirate her book could not find a free link, her book sold out in 2 days. Putting all these pieces together, I think we can all kind of come together and agree, okay, yes, book piracy is affecting the book industry. When books are pirated, authors are less likely to make money. Publishers are less likely to want to pick up their books and sell large amounts of their book because they can't, because books are being pirated. And also, authors don't make a lot of money. So if you're pirating their books, they need those royalties. They might even need your purchase to just get them past their advance amount, right? And so by pirating their books, we're denying authors the ability to work as full-time authors. If you want to publish a book but you genuinely don't think that it can sell and genuinely don't think that it will do well, you're going to be discouraged. And if you're an author who is a full-time author and is trying to sustain that lifestyle, it must be so frustrating to see your fans justify pirating and to see links of your book on these free websites. That all being said, like, this is the thing that I want to start this conversation with, right? This piracy is bad, piracy has bad effects, right? I'm not going to ever go against this statement. But I have an issue with where the conversation went. And I want to talk about defining piracy as a lost sale, which I think is a pretty fair definition and pretty much ties into what I've already said, right? Because free copies of books were available online, people who may have bought that book did not buy it, so it counts as a lost sale. So for example, let's say I want to read A Court of, what's the third one in the book series? A Court of Wings and Ruin, the third book in that series, which I haven't read yet. Let's say I wanted to read it, right? I could hypothetically buy that book. But maybe I don't really feel like buying it, maybe I don't really feel like having it on my shelf, so I go and I find a PDF online and I read it that way. That is very clearly a potential sale lost. I have the means to buy that book, I have the interest to buy that book, but instead of buying that book, I've read it online, and that is my money lost from selling that book. People often think as well that piracy, reading a PDF online, and going to the library is similar, right? Because the libraries are free, but that is also not the case. Libraries have a really big impact as well on how the author does. Let's say you're a local library and you keep getting requests for one of Adam Silvera's books, right? People keep asking to borrow More Happy Than Not. You don't have a lot of copies, so maybe you buy a few more copies so more people can read it. Maybe you display that book in your library because it's so popular. Maybe you recommend it to patrons who want a recommendation. Maybe you put it on your summer reading list for students, right? Libraries also affect how well books do. So here's my issue though. This is where I had a problem with this discussion, is that, and this is no fault of the authors talking about this on Twitter or of people firing back at the authors, but the conversation turned into focusing on hypothetical poor people. What a lot of people would say to these authors is, well, what if you're too poor to buy it? What if you can never buy it in the first place? Does that still count as piracy? And these authors would fire back and be like, yup, still piracy. And that is where the conversation really began to focus. And there were some things that authors said that I don't quite like. Some person, I don't know who he is, but Adam Silvera retweeted him, said, you know, if you're gonna steal, fine steal, but don't try to justify your theft, especially if you're stealing something purely for your entertainment, e.g. a book. You're not owed it, you just wanted it. And Adam Silvera tweeted something similar. He said, you do not get to steal, period. I was so poor and didn't steal no matter how badly I wanted new sneakers or wanted to play a video game. Pirating supports piracy sites. Books are a luxury and authors won't have careers without sales to back them up. This is not hard. And all of these things are true, right? Book piracy affects authors. You shouldn't pirate books. But one, I have a problem with this kind of idea of books being a luxury, and I recognize that they are in a sense, right? Most people count non-luxury things as like food, water, and like a place to live, if even that. I will acknowledge that I think I have a broader sense or desire, understanding of what counts as a luxury and what we should all be owed as human beings, but I think all of us on BookTube and all authors can agree the massive impact that art has on our lives. Without trying to inadvertently quote Dead Poets Society too much, art is what makes our lives worth living. Art is often what we stay alive for. We listen to music every day, we watch movies, we watch TV shows, we read magazines, we read books, we listen to podcasts. We consume art constantly, and art is the most enriching thing that there is. And so I really don't like this idea that books are a luxury, and if you're too poor to have them, too bad. I'm not saying you have to support piracy. I'm not saying you have to say it's fine if you're poor, but it takes such a hard line bothers me. And I know people are going to say, well, okay, what about libraries, right? If you're poor, just go to a library. That is not an option for everybody. I live in New York City. I have a fantastic library. I've never once had an issue getting a book out of my library. I might have needed to wait longer than I would have liked to for that book, but I still got the book in the end. That is not the case for everyone. If you live in a really small town, your library is super far away, it's a small library, a small conservative town, let's say, and you want to read Adam Silvera's books. I don't mean to keep harping on Adam Silvera, but it's just like on my mind from this conversation. You want to read a book by an author that's about queer teens of color. There is no guarantee that your conservative library will want to have that book, period. So there's no guarantee that you could ever read it from a library. And if you're a poor teen, you've got no access to income, no means to buy those books, do you really count as a lost sale? That's the question I really want to pose. Do people who will never have access to these books in the foreseeable future, they don't have any money and they don't have access to a library, do they count as a lost sale if they never would have bought it in the first place? And I'm not saying that we have to be like, oh, you're right, in that case it's not a lost sale, it's fine, because as other authors point out, reading books on piracy sites supports piracy, it sustains piracy, right? So you still have an effect on that industry, you still are making it profitable for people to pirate books. But it really, really bothers me how this conversation turned into punching down on these hypothetical poor people who pirate books. Because this is a much larger conversation, right? We're talking about people not having access to art, period. Our conversation should not just be like, I don't give a shit, I was poor too, don't pirate. It should be one of more compassion. It should be one that brings in a more interdisciplinary understanding of what causes people to pirate and what causes people not to have access to things. Again, this is not the author's jobs on Twitter to solve this problem, but it does irk me where the conversation went and how it was focusing on just berating hypothetical poor people for pirating and having zero compassion for what it must be like to not have access to books. I can't imagine ever, like being a kid or being an adult or being anyone who literally can't afford books and can barely get the books that I want to read out of my local library, not even counting people who live too far away from libraries to even commute to the library in the first place. Just, there's so much more to this issue than just, oh, poor people want to pirate books. Again, let me reiterate this. I'm not saying that you have to get rid of your hard stance on piracy is bad, but you can't have those conversations and talk about these poor people that you want to send your conversation around without mentioning all those topics about access. That's number one. And number two, which I think is much more important, we're talking about the wrong people here. Let me bring in some facts that I thought were just so enlightening. Shout out to @PossiblyLit, I think her name is Emily, on Twitter, for doing this really awesome thread. She was talking about the same thing that I was saying, how frustrated she was about the book piracy discussions that were going on, because the people who are mainly responsible for piracy avoid the blame, and that is financially stable middle-aged men. She included a study that showed that the most common demographic of someone who illegally downloads books is a man between the ages of 30 to 44 with an annual income between $50,000 and $99,000. She goes on to say that in 2006, so in 1 year, illegally pirated books cost the publishing industry an estimated $315 million. I'm not saying that poor teens or poor people aren't the ones pirating books, but this study demonstrates that we're blaming the wrong people primarily, right? And I know that this conversation got away from some authors, but we're talking about these poor people and why they shouldn't pirate books. Why aren't we talking about those people in general? Because their reason for pirating books, I will wager to say, is different. I'm not saying that people who are poor who pirate books are doing it for some crazy noble reason. They might just want to read the book for free. But if you can afford books and you choose not to pay for it, that is you saying that that person's art does not have value, that that person's art is not worth paying for. And that is the main issue that these authors are trying to push back against. They're trying to prove that their art is worth money, that they deserve to be paid for the things that they have done, and these financially stable middle-aged men are denying them that by not buying their books, right? Those are people who are 100% potential sales lost. Obviously, I don't know the life of every middle-aged man with that kind of income. I don't know what they're spending their money on. Some of them might not have money for books, right? But we can pretty much glean that they are a financially stable part of our country. And if they're pirating books, they could have bought Gone Girl, they could have bought the Da Vinci Code, but they pirated it instead because they didn't see an issue with that, because they didn't see a problem with not giving an author what is due. So I think it is really important to educate people on piracy, right? To kind of get rid of that sentiment. I think in general we have an issue with people not wanting to pay artists for what they're worth and across all industries. But the way that we address this problem is not by taking this hard stance on how poor people shouldn't pirate books. It's at looking at the demographics of people who pirate. It's about really trying to dig down and prove why art is worth paying for. And I don't think that's what this conversation was doing on Twitter. I think that's everything I wanted to say. If I were to sum up this video in a couple points, it would be 1, piracy is bad. Piracy hurts the publishing industry immensely. Authors are not paid enough for their work, authors struggle to get those books out there, and pirating only makes it harder for authors to live and do the work they want to do. People who pirate the most are stable, middle-aged men who make an income. They are the true lost sales, and the reason they pirate is because we don't value art, and we don't see art as worth paying for, and that is what we need to change. 4, the last point, let's stop focusing this conversation around hypothetical poor people. Let's stop punching down on poor people and blaming them for piracy, or centering our conversations around whether or not it's okay to pirate if you're poor. I'm not saying you have to say it's okay to pirate if you're poor, but if you want to talk about those hypothetical poor people, conversation needs to include the issue of access. It needs to include the issue of income inequality. It needs to include the issue that we often don't see art as worth paying for, don't see art as a human right, don't see it as something that people deserve to have access to, and that all doubles down and leads into these common problems that I've been talking about. That is what I want to say in this video. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I will link all the information that I mentioned down below, all of my sources and stuff. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm sorry this is a long one. All my videos have been really long lately and I apologize, but I really want to talk about this. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon with another video soon.